Just because Stern says the Mets aren't going to extend him now, or likely not going to extend him now before the season, let this thing play out. That's what Stearns and the Mets should do. That's what Pete Alonso and Scott Boras should do, and it's what they want to do because Pete wants the most money, regardless of what anybody thinks. But ultimately, they'll play the season out, and the Mets are going to extend Pete Alonso. Everybody just needs to calm down. Pete Alonso will be a lifelong Met.
I think when people get a little bit worked up, it's often because their instincts are telling them something's about to happen that they don't necessarily want to happen. And it's like almost like a self-protective mode here. You see, David Stearns is not emotionally invested to anybody that he inherited, nor should he be. The writing is on the wall, and it stinks. Do you think I'm changing my opinion today? I don't think Pete wants to be here as much as many people think that he might or hope that he wants to be here. And I'm quite sure the Mets are open to moving him. I think he's gone, dude. I mean, I've said it for 6 months. I don't think the Mets are married to this guy, to him as a player. And I think that the smart move for the franchise, and more importantly, even though it's what Met fans don't want to hear, I think the Mets have inwardly reconciled what I just said. They do not view him as a smart signing.
See, I don't get that, BT. I understand why you're saying it. I'm not getting that sense from the Mets. The sense I'm getting from the Mets is similar to what we saw with Brandon Nimmo, Edwin Diaz too, but that was never really the issue. With Brandon Nimmo, Jacob deGrom, let the season play out and see what goes on. Obviously, deGrom, they wanted to bring him back, but they weren't going to bring him back at the price that he ended up getting from the Rangers, and they were right. Because of Steve Cohen's finances, they are in the position of power to where they could say, okay, you don't like the deal we offered you now, go play the season out. We hope you hit 70 home runs because if you do, we're going to make the playoffs, and then we'll give you more than whatever you're going to get on the open market. The open market will dictate. Pete thinks he's worth Aaron Judge type money, or let's say $300 million. The Mets think he's worth Matt Olson money, or let's say roughly $200 million, and they'll probably end up meeting somewhere in between. But Met fans feel like, oh, extend him, extend him, extend him. A, that would be stupid. B, Pete Alonso doesn't want an extension, and you're right. If you think Pete Alonso wants to be a Met, first and foremost, we're going to find out. You don't hire Scott Boras if you want to be with the same team. You hire Scott Boras for one reason and one reason only, and that is to get the most money. And that's not his fault, but that's the reality. And I happen to think that when all is said and done, they'll play this thing out, and at the end of the year, Scott Boras will test the open market, and the New York Mets will give Pete Alonso the most money, and he will be a Met.
I think he's gone. And, Stearns comes in here, and in a lot of ways, he's in an enviable position because he can make every decision independent of emotion. Nothing he does is connected to somebody that he drafted or was in the room the night that he was drafted or, saw player X ascend up the minor league system and become a viable major league prospect or beyond. He comes in here and he is cold-blooded, and he needs to be, and he has been. Even though he's got that, that little disarming smile, David Stearns is calculating a future for the Mets that's not just about, a random, amazing 101-win season that completely falls apart the next year. David Stearns is here to eventually make the Mets a dynasty. And David Stearns is a smart baseball man. He's a forward thinker. He relies on analytics a lot. Outside of power, almost every analytic is unfavorable to Pete Alonso, and he knows that. He knows it, Sal.
Yeah, I trust that Stearns is a smart baseball guy. I also think that the Mets would be open to trading him, especially if things are going south prior to the deadline. I still don't think that means they can't revisit talks to try to bring him back. They know, the Mets know how important he is to the fan base. They understand the public blowback that they would get for losing a guy. This is even different than deGrom, BT, because the only reason why the Mets wouldn't give deGrom the money that he ended up getting from the Rangers was because of health. That is not the issue with Pete Alonso. So the only issue here is where Pete and his camp value himself versus what the market says for a player of his position and his caliber, and that's what the Mets are saying. I don't think the Mets are saying we're going to try to undercut Pete Alonso and get him on the discount. They just want to pay what they think is fair.
Yeah.
He thinks he's worth more. Ultimately, He's not going to get what he thinks he's going to get on the open market, which is why I think he's going to be back, even if they do trade him. Now, it's a different story saying, would you trade him? Should they trade him? Whatever. That's different than what we're saying here. The reality is both these sides playing this the right way, letting this thing play out, and then it's going to come to a head in the offseason. Now, what will really be the test is if, like Judge, remember, Judge let it play out, has a historic year, gets more money elsewhere, but still signed back to be a New York Yankee. Mm-hmm. I am fascinated to find out if, let's say, the Cubs offer Alonso $260 or $250, and the Mets say, we're at $225, $230, that's it, what Pete says. Now, that to me is the only way that maybe he leaves the Mets is if somebody blows him away with an offer that's so ridiculous the Mets don't want him.
Or he just wants a more winning situation. It's funny because we talk about what the Met fan goes through and how they ride out these losing seasons, for the most part, year after year, or at least underwhelming, underachieving seasons. But we don't really calculate the players' emotions here. We look at money. And listen, you're right. Cohen's obviously going to come correct with that check. I've always said that. If there's somebody he wants, he will not be outspent. I believe that, okay? But the Mets, right, Pete Alonso is at a point where, he's got a couple of prime years left. Mets aren't going to be very good this year. That's my assertion. If I'm wrong, then that's good for Pete. That's good for Sal. That's good for you, the Met fans. That's good for everybody, all right? But if they are the team that I think that they will be, Pete's going to look around and say, what am I doing, man? I've got a finite window to, certainly from an earnings power point of view, and I've got a finite window to win. And I think it's becoming convoluted where money, home run power, all-time Met, and those things are indisputable. I think Pete wants to win.
Yeah,
and he ain't going to win here right now.
Well, that's not necessarily true.
I don't think he is.
Well, maybe not this year, but even with this year, David Stern's again doubling down on the idea that this could be a playoff team. So even with this year, where there are little expectations by many, they're saying playoffs. Next year, they better be competing to go out there and win a World Series. I would think that they'd have one of the better teams going into the season. Now, again, I don't know. We have to see it play out, but I don't think there's going to be a spot where, the Mets are going to be losing and Pete doesn't want to sign on to a loser. I really believe, Met fans want to think that Pete wants to be a Met, and maybe he does. I don't believe that that's the case. I believe, he of course would love to be a Met, but I believe Pete wants the money. And as he should, right? You're a free agent, you want to get paid. I believe that's the number one thing he wanted. Now, I also thought that that's what Aaron Judge wanted. Turns out Judge turned down more money to go to the Yankees. So we have seen it before. DeGrom didn't. DeGrom talked a good game while he was here. We tried to warn you, saying, you know what, there's going to be issues here. And DeGrom ended up leaving for more money. Will Pete Alonso do the same thing? I don't think so, because I think the Mets will ultimately have the highest offer, knowing the value that he brings to the fan base, of the franchise, all those different things. But there's just a significant gap in where the Mets value Pete for the position he plays and all that he brings versus where Pete thinks that he is.
We want to get these calls, obviously, 877-337-6666. Real fast, Al. I see three scenarios playing out. Two are very unlikely. One is the most plausible, all right? But then I'll tell you why I don't think it leads to him remaining with the Mets. Number one, Pete bombs, the Mets struggle. That's not going to happen. Pete's a massive home run hitter. He's going to put up numbers. So I don't worry about that. Number two.
What is bomb, though? Like, he hit 220 last year. That's not a good year.
Well, that's what I'm saying. But I mean where the home runs just fall. They just level out. Like, Pete, if he plays every day, Pete's not going to. Well, he could hit 230. He's not going to hit 29 home runs. So the Mets will not be horrible, and Pete will not have an all-time worst year. That's not even remotely in the equation for me. I think most people would probably agree. Number two, the Mets win big, and Pete plays amazing. I don't think that's very likely, although I do think Pete will play well, because the Mets ain't winning this year. What I see happening is the Mets will struggle, and Pete Alonso will play well, because he always does. And then I think the Mets will be tasked with a very tough, direct question that they will not answer publicly. Doesn't matter what David Stern said. Yes, it means nothing what he said. No kidding, he's going to go to free agency. Hey, that's Scott Boras. What matters, though, and they will reconcile within. They're going to look around, they're going to say, all right, this guy just hit 48 home runs again, whatever. We had a rough year. He's going to be 31 in 2025. And we're going to give him 7 years? No, they're not. they're going to realize that they can build it differently and build it better. And it's not a diss on Pete. It's not a knock on his talent. It's an understanding and a recognition of how modern baseball works.
Yeah, I think two ways it plays out. One, the Mets are so bad that they consider trading him at the trade deadline and then are open to bringing him back. Two, they have a good year, solid year, whether they make the playoffs or not, they have a good year, but Pete has a strong year, and then they bring him back. I also, a big factor in this is I don't think anybody's going to offer him what he thinks he's worth anyway. This is not just about the Mets. It's about what the market is going to dictate. He's worth $200 million to the Mets. Is he worth $220 to somebody else? And then do the Mets say they want to come up and give him that much? It's going to be fascinating, but the reality is Met fans now should be aware that they're not signing an extension now. This is going to play out. It's the right thing for both sides. It doesn't mean, though, Pete is going to be, not a Met long term. Our friends at Town Fair Tire remind you that at Town Fair Tire, you always get the guaranteed lowest price on name brand tires from Connecticut to Maine. Nobody beats Town Fair Tire. Nobody.
All right, Sal, let's start hammering these out. A mixed bag and a lot of passion, you would imagine. Anytime we talk about Pete, it is you guys are ready to go. First up, Danny and Belmore, Pete with BT and Sal. What's going on, Dan?
What's up, BT? What's up, Sal? Good to be
What's
talking
up, dude?
baseball again. Baseball season's finally back for us. Headed down to spring training tomorrow, down to West Palm Beach, Port St. Lucie area. Looking forward to that.
Nice.
Awesome.
So, listen, with Pete, it's very complicated with Pete, but here's what I see happening. I think the Mets have a mediocre year. They squeak into the playoffs, and Pete has a big year. I hear you guys talking about his batting average last year. I don't really go too much off of that because he had no protection in the lineup. I'm looking for Alvarez to kind of be that protection this year as a power bat for the lineup and for Pete. But for the Mets, I think they're doing the right thing with Pete right now, just kind of waiting it out and seeing how this year goes. They're only bidding against themselves right now. You know what I mean? So let's see what he does this year and then see once he gets to free agency what the offers are like. Like Sal said, I don't see him getting these huge number contracts, similar to I see him more like an Olsen than anyone.
Right, and that should be the comp, right, BT? I mean, we talked about this a lot. See, here's the thing, though. I think a lot of Met fans, and this is a debate, BT, we've been having this debate since last summer. Like, a lot of Met fans are very sensitive to Pete, and understandably so. You could argue right now that the guy's the greatest position player that the franchise has ever seen. However, the smart thing to do is to let this play out. It does not mean that Pete is not going to re-sign with the Mets, assuming that they offer him the most money, which I think they will. That's where you and I disagree.
Yeah, and the other thing, too, is I think we're quickly dispelling some of these other teams that might be ready to jump out of the weeds and hand him a check that the Mets do not feel is worthy matching. The Orioles' new ownership group, not messing around. You get a veteran righty stick with those kids, okay, I would rule them out. I know Artie Moreno's kind of kept the Wildland under wrap a little bit lately here, but if he gets frisky out there with the Angels, who knows? And I think you even have to look at something like the Rogers group up in Toronto, which is the most at number one. Cohen's number two, not number one. The Rogers group is number one. So, they were making a play for Ohtani. They basically been a play for everybody. They were just dying to give money away. I do think that when we just flippantly say, nobody's going to get Pete that, I don't think that that's accurate necessarily.
Well, what do you think he's going to get on the open market?
I don't know. Because the only reason I say
what's
that,
the
Sal,
well, I know your value, but
Yep.
what do you think his value is?
All right, I'll give you an answer, but I need you to give me an answer to this question. Is his batting average the same as last year? That matters.
Let's say it's in between, right? What is he, career 250, and he hit 220 last year? Let's say it's 240-ish, 235, 240.
235. All right. If it's,
But you're not paying him for batting average anyway. You're paying him for home runs.
No, I understand that. But if it's 2 years in a row for a slow-footed guy, the batting average, I know it's antiquated.
All right, so
blah, blah, blah.
let's say he hits 250. Let's say he hits his career average.
Okay, and by the way, I think, in Pete's defense, I think he's probably going to rally and more closely resemble his career numbers in terms of batting average than last year. I think last year will be proven to be a bit of an outlier, but he's got to do it. If he does it, which I think he will do, I think that the most amount of years, I mean, dude, Chapman is not even signed. He's Brooks Robinson at third base, not with the power. I get that. Bellinger's not. These guys aren't signed. So you can look at it one of two ways. Advantage Mets because the market's changed and it's almost probably like this loose interpretation of collusion out there amongst owners. Hey, listen, guys, get 29, 30, 31. Don't sign them. Let them wait to spring training, and we get them on 75 cents on the dollar. So if that happens, obviously it opens up a pathway for the Mets to get him a little bit on the cheap. But acknowledging who he is, what he isn't, I would say 6 years, 30 is 180. I would say 6 years, about 185, 190.
Right. But that's close to what Olsen got. I know Olsen got more years, I think, on that. But he was around the same total, wasn't he? 179.
Yeah, Olsen got 168. This is also a couple years ago, though.
Oh, 168. Okay.
A couple years ago.
Pete's getting 200. I think he's getting 200 million. But it's just a matter of, to me, how much over he's going to get of that 200 million.
I got you. How about Chris in Flint, Michigan? What's going on, Chris? BT and Sal, how are you?
Hey guys, how you doing?
Hello.
Yeah, I got all the football stuff put up. Got all my Mets stuff ready to roll for baseball season. I can't wait. Sorry you guys got dumped on some snow out there, but I got to say I agree with Sal. I think they play out this year. I do think Pete is going to be a Met for life. I mean, he's going to get a pretty good-sized deal, obviously. And I know what you're saying, BT, about Stearns is a different kind of a GM when it comes to teams, but he's never had an owner like Cohen. And Cohen, he may be a little more hands-off now, but he's going to have a say. And I think he's going to want to keep Pete around and give him some money to keep him happy.
Chris, can I ask you a question, Chris? Chris, can I actually thought that about Cohen, not his willingness to spend. He's going to spend. Pertaining specifically to Pete, I always thought, because Cohen's a Mets fan. So you would think that a Mets fan who's worth $15 billion is going to keep what eventually is going to be the all-time best Met around. Well, if that's the case, why was Billy Epler and the rest of the Mets organization given at least loose permission to explore his value on the trade market when Stearns was in Milwaukee?
So when I think about that, I got to believe they were just putting out feelers to see kind of what people were offering for him to kind of gauge what he might go for.
Well, that pissed him off, Chris. Even if you're right, even if it's just due diligence, which I get as well, you are running the risk of alienating your best player emotionally. He's probably sitting there saying, "Dude, I'm like the only guy here who plays well every year, and now you're going to have trade talks with the Brewers? You don't think that bothered him?"
I don't know if he got upset by that.
It would bother me, Sal.
Yeah, why? I mean, why? If you get fine, trade me. You don't want me, trade me, and I'm going to go somewhere else, and I'll make sure you pay every time you play me, and I'm going to go get my money anyway. I think Pete. Now, I'm not saying
I think that's what he's thinking.
Well, okay, but wouldn't he want that anyway? The most money.
Think about this on a human level, Sal. I mean, Pete Alonso. Imagine, it's not a great radio equivalent, but just imagine being here 5 or 6 years, you and I, and being number one for 5 or 6 years. And if there were trades in radio, we get wind of, they want to trade us to do afternoon drive in Milwaukee. We're like, what? That wouldn't piss you off?
No, I mean, I understand.
Me.
I understand what you're saying. I don't think look, that's the nature of the beast. I mean,
understand that.
And they never got close to trading him, regardless of what the reports were. And I don't think Pete would care if they signed him. And I do think they are going to. Look, I do think the Mets tried to sign him. He thinks he's worth more than what they think. But they also understand the value that he brings to their organization. Pete Alonso is worth more to the New York Mets than he is to anybody else. So they're going to have to overpay a little bit to retain him. It's just a matter of how much they're going to be willing to go to that extent. They don't need to do it now. Do it at the end of the year. But ultimately, I would still be shocked if Pete Alonso was not wearing a Mets uniform the rest of his career. BT and Sal on the fan. We'll come back, continue with your calls on the other side. We want to get into some Yankee stuff as well coming up at 11 o'clock. Carlos Rodon had some interesting comments to say, so we'll get into that.